My name is Delia Fontaine, and I am 79 years old, and I am sitting at the kitchen table of the house where I was born, which is the same table where my mother sat when she made me give my word. I have kept that word for 61 years. My mother has been gone since the spring of 1988, which means she has been gone 37 years. And I have been keeping this promise longer than she was alive to know I was keeping it. She died on the 14th of April at 3:15 in the afternoon, with my hand in hers and the window open so the smell of the thaw could come in, and her last words to me were not about the thing in the barn, she said. Instead, that she hoped I had been happy. I told her I had been. I believe that was true. But she is gone, and my brother Fernand is gone, and the hired man, Octave Pelletier, who worked our farm from 1951 to 1967, is gone. And the Deschaines family, who kept the farm 2 concessions east, is gone, scattered to Sudbury and Thunder Bay, and one of them, the youngest daughter Sylvie, to Vancouver. I am the last one who was present from the beginning. I am 79 years old, and my doctor tells me my heart is doing what hearts do when they have been working for 79 winters in the north of Ontario. And I have decided that the promise I gave my mother at this same table on a February evening in 1964, when I was 17 years old, has now outlived the reason she asked me to give it. I have a small recording machine that belongs to my granddaughter Therese. Therese left it here last summer when she came to help me put up preserves, and she said, "Mémère, you should record yourself telling the old stories before they're only in your head." She did not know what she was asking. I told her thank you, I would think about it, and I put the machine in the drawer beside the sink, and I thought about it for 8 months. And now it is February again, the same month my mother made me swear, and outside this window the snow is the same depth it was that night, which is to say it is very deep, and the barn where it lived is still standing, 80 yards from this window, though we have not kept livestock in it since 1981. I am going to tell Therese's machine what I should have told someone a long time ago. This is what I remember. My father, Gérard Fontaine, died on the 3rd of November 1956, when I was 9 years old and Fernand was 12. He died of a blood clot in the brain that came on a Wednesday morning while he was splitting kindling in the yard, and by Thursday he was gone. He was 41 years old, which seems to me now an almost impossible age to die, though at the time it seemed only enormous and wrong and final. He was a lean, particular man with large hands and a habit of naming things precisely, and after he died our mother, whose name was Clothilde Fontaine, née Barrette, picked up the work of the farm without any visible adjustment, the way a person who has always carried a heavy load picks up one more bundle and walks on. She was 38 years old. She had 2 children, 80 acres of mixed bush and hayfield in Nipissing County, a hired man who came when the season called for it and left when it did not, and a set of opinions about what was owed and what was not that she had derived from her own mother and never revised. She was, in the language of the country and the time, a capable woman. I understood, even at 9, that this was the highest thing she could be called. We kept a small herd, 7 Holsteins, and a bull my father had named Mathieu after his own father, and a pig and chickens, and 2 horses of the working variety that my father had named Santé and Croix as a joke about the road he'd grown up on. The barn was a good one, built in 1932 by my grandfather, with help from the neighbouring farms, in the fashion of that time, a post and beam structure with a gambrel roof and board and batten siding that my father had repainted red in the summer of 1953, the last summer before things started to go differently. The barn mattered. The barn was, in a material sense, the farm. Everything that kept us eating and warm and present on the land was in or around or because of that barn. I do not know precisely when it came. That is the first of the things I cannot tell you. And there are several, and I will name them plainly when I reach them, rather than pretend to a knowledge I do not have. What I know is that in the winter of 1958, the winter I was 11, the cows began behaving strangely. Not frightened, which is what you might expect me to say. They were not frightened. They were, if I am to be accurate about it, calmer than they had ever been. The bull Mathieu, who had always been short-tempered in the way of bulls, and had sent Octave Pelletier into the fence boards twice in 2 years, became in that winter a placid and cooperative animal. The horses stood quiet at the back of their stalls in a way my father had always struggled to achieve before a hard morning's work. My mother noticed this before I did. She noticed most things before I did. She said nothing about it to me for a long time. The first sign I noticed myself was the arrangement of the straw. On the morning of the 15th of January, 1959, I went to help my mother with the early feeding, which was my job on school days, since Octave did not come in winter, and I found the loose straw in the loft rearranged. This requires explanation. Loose straw in a working loft is chaotic in the way of all working things, scattered and compressed and layered at random by the fork and the boot, and ours was no different. But on that morning, a section of the loft, roughly 8 feet by 5 feet, in the northwest corner, against the double board wall, had been gathered and pressed into a smooth, dense mat. I do not mean swept or tidied. I mean gathered by something with hands into a deliberate and level surface, edges pressed down, center slightly hollowed, the way a large animal makes a sleeping place in tall grass, but done with intent and precision that grass pressing does not have. It was the most purposeful thing I had ever seen in that loft, and I stood at the top of the ladder and looked at it for a long time before I called down to my mother. She came up the ladder, and she looked at it, and she stood beside me, and she did not say anything for what seemed to me like a very long time. Then she said, in her plain way, that an animal must have got in through the ventilation boards on the north face, which the cold had loosened, and that Octave would have to nail them down when he came back in March. I said, "What kind of animal makes a bed like that?" She said she did not know, and she picked up the fork and spread the straw back the way it had been. And we went on with the feeding, and neither of us mentioned it again that day, though I thought about it all through school. It happened again. 3 more times that winter, twice the following winter, and then with a regularity I can only describe as seasonal, every winter from 1960 onward through the years I am going to tell you about. Always the same corner, always the same dimensions, roughly 8 feet long, which is a very great length for any animal I had heard of in Ontario, always pressed flat and smooth, always in the night. We never heard it happen. The cows and horses never showed any sign that anything had disturbed them in the night, and we would go out at first light to find the corner of the loft arranged as if by a patient and careful hand, and the snow on the north side of the barn undisturbed, and no tracks of any kind in the yard. This is the part that I have turned over in my mind the most, across 61 years. No tracks, Whatever came in had a way of coming and going that left no mark in the snow, and the snow in the yard around the barn was always deep enough and firm enough to have shown us very clearly if anything had walked across it of any size. Octave Pelletier nailed down the ventilation boards in March of 1959 as my mother had asked, and replaced the nails with longer ones in the fall, and checked them every November from then on, and the boards held, and whatever arrangement was happening in the loft continued regardless. I began in the winter of 1960 to go out in the evenings. I was 13 years old, and it was not a clever or considered thing to do. I simply found that after supper, when my mother was mending by the stove and Fernand was doing his schoolwork, I felt a pull toward the barn that I did not fully understand, but did not want to resist. I told my mother I was going to check on the cows. She let me go. I think she knew by then more than she told me, but she let me go, and the knowing of that is something I have lived with. The first night I saw anything was the 20th of December, 1960. I had turned 13 the previous September. I remember the date because it was the night of the new moon, and the yard was dark except for the lamplight from the kitchen window, and a very faint blue that the snow gave off from no particular source, the way snow does. I had gone out at 8 o'clock and sat on the low stool behind the cow stanchions with a lantern turned down very low, and I had sat there for perhaps an hour without moving, listening to the cows breathe and the wind find the cracks in the boards. It did not come through the doors, which I had left slightly open. It came through the wall. I do not mean through a gap in the wall. I mean that a section of the north face boards, 2 boards wide and perhaps 6 feet tall, opened inward as smoothly as a door opens, and something stepped through it, and the boards closed again behind it. And I understood then what I had not understood before, which was that the boards had not been loosened by cold. They had been fitted, carefully, over months or years, to open and close without nails holding them, and no one had noticed because the heads of the old nails were still in the wood from outside, but the shanks had been worked free. The precision of this required a kind of patience and intelligence I had not, until that moment, associated with anything that lived in the forest outside our fence. What stood in the far end of the barn, with its back to me in the half-dark, was very large. I will not say I was not afraid. I was afraid in the first few seconds, the way you are afraid when a large wave takes you before you understand you are a swimmer. And then the horses, who could see it clearly, made no sound, and the cows did not shift in their stanchions, and the animal smell of the barn did not change, and the fear passed as cleanly as the wave. I sat on my low stool with my lantern turned down, and I watched. It moved to the far corner of the barn floor and stood there for a long while. Its back was still to me, and I could see only the shape of it, very broad across the shoulders, narrow at the hip by comparison, the fur on its back dark brown and very thick, and the arms, which hung at its sides in the posture of a being that knows it does not need to guard itself, extremely long. The top of its head was perhaps 2 feet below the beam that ran across the barn at 9 feet, which meant it was, by my estimate, something between 7 and 7.5 feet tall. I say feet because I had no other measure in my mind. It stood there, and then it went to the ladder of the loft and went up, with a quietness that I found more astonishing than the size. And I heard nothing above me, and after a time I climbed the ladder myself and looked over the edge. It was in the corner, lying down, I could see only the shape of it in the dim light, the enormous rise of the shoulder, the head tucked down, and the straw pressed flat and smooth beneath it, and the cows below me breathing, and outside the wind, and nothing else. I went back inside. I did not tell my mother that night. I lay in my bed, and I thought about the size of the hands that had worked those boards loose, and I thought about the months of patience that required. And I thought about the fact that it had never done anything to us or to the animals, and I went to sleep. I told her in the morning. She was standing at the stove when I came down, and I sat at this same table, and I told her what I had seen, in the plain way she had always required, with measurements where I had them, and admissions of uncertainty where I did not. She did not turn from the stove until I was done. When she turned, she looked at me for a long time, and her face was the colour of the kitchen wall, which was a pale cream, and meant nothing about what she was feeling, because her face was always like that when she was deciding something large. Then she sat down across from me, and she told me what she knew. She had seen it for the first time in the fall of 1958, 2 years before I had. She had gone to the barn alone at night, late, because one of the cows was near her time, and she wanted to check on her, and she had gone in through the side door quietly, so as not to startle anything. And it had been there in the loft, in the corner, and she had seen enough of it in the lantern light to know. It was nothing she had a name for. She had stood at the base of the loft ladder for what she described to me as a long time, and it had not moved, and the cows had not stirred, and she had made a decision there at the base of that ladder that she did not describe to me in terms of reasoning. She said only that she had looked at the animals, and they were calm, and she had turned around and gone back to the house, and she had not told me or Fernand, because she did not yet know what there was to tell. She had watched it as I had, over the next 2 years, more carefully than I knew. She had found the fitted boards before I thought to look for them, and she had looked at the precision of the fitting and drawn her own conclusions about the kind of being that could work wood that way over time, without tools, which were the same conclusions I had drawn, though she expressed them differently. She said only that it was a careful thing and patient, and that it had chosen our barn among all the barns it might have chosen, and that she did not think it had chosen wrong. She asked me only one thing. She asked me whether, in all the times I had been out there, it had ever once given me reason to be afraid of it after the first moment. I said no. She nodded, as if this confirmed something, and she poured the coffee. And we sat at this table with our coffee, and we talked about it the way we talked about the cows, which is to say practically and without drama. She named it, my mother, not in the way you name a pet, but in the way you give a name to a weather pattern or a kind of wood, because you need to be able to refer to it. She called it Le Grand, the big one, which was not inventive but was accurate, and which became over the years simply the term we used between ourselves and later with Octave and the Deschênes, with Fernand knowing and not knowing in the strange way of 14-year-old boys who are shown something they do not have a category for and simply absorb it into the fabric of daily life without comment. Fernand knew by the spring of 1961. He found the fitted boards himself, the same way I had found the straw, by paying attention to the things that were wrong and following them to their source. He was 16 and practical in the way of our father, and his first response was to measure the door with a length of baling twine and announce that whatever made it was very large and must have feet like a man, because the sill was pressed down in two places at the same width as a very large man's feet, only deeper and wider. He accepted this information about the world with the equanimity that characterized his whole approach to things, which was to say, "This is what is. What do we do about it?" What we did about it was nothing for a long time. We continued our daily life in the specific and unremarkable way of farming families in northern Ontario in the early 1960s, and Legrand continued to use the corner of our loft in winter. And our cows continued to give good milk, and our horses continued to work without difficulty, and we did not speak of it to anyone beyond the farm fence for 3 years. The first person we told was Octave Pelletier, and we told him because we had no choice. It was the fall of 1963, the 2nd of September, which is still warm in Nipissing County, and Octave was in the loft moving hay bales to make room for the new cutting. And it was there in the loft in the late afternoon in a way it had never been before. It was nearly always nocturnal, but on this afternoon it had come in through the fitted boards in the heat of the day and was asleep in the corner, and Octave went up the ladder with his baling hook and found it before any of us could have warned him. We heard him on the ladder, and then we heard the particular silence that comes when a man has lost his voice from something other than cold. And then we heard him come back down the ladder, slowly, one rung at a time, and he came out of the barn and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at my mother. Octave Pelletier was 53 years old at that time, a lean, weathered man from Verna who had been farm labour all his life and had opinions only about practical things. Soil conditions, equipment, the reliability of certain breeds of cattle in particular weathers. He was not a man given to interpretation or to the elaboration of feeling, and his face, as he stood in the yard, told nothing except that he was working through something, the way he worked through a mechanical problem, methodically, from one side to the other. My mother waited. He put his hat back on his head. He said, in his flat Verna way, that it was a good thing there was hay enough in the lower barn to feed through the next week, because he was not going back in the loft today. My mother said that was reasonable. He said, after a moment, that he supposed it did not bother the animals. She said no, it did not. He said he had heard from his father of such things, not in any specific way, but in the general way of old knowledge that does not come with explanations, and that his father had held the opinion that where one of these went, the livestock came to no harm. My mother said that had been her experience. He nodded and went back to work in the lower barn, and that was, in its entirety, his process of accepting what he had seen. He never spoke of it to anyone, as far as I ever knew, and he kept working our farm until he retired in 1967. The Deschaines came into it differently. Marcel Deschaines was my mother's closest neighbour, in the sense that the Deschaines farm was 2 concessions east, and his wife, Hortense, and my mother had been friends since they were young women, the kind of friendship built on 30 years of shared seasons and no illusions. Marcel was a large, red-faced man who kept beef cattle and had a laugh that could be heard from the road. His wife Hortense was small and deliberate, and had the most accurate eye for the state of things, human and animal, and otherwise, of anyone I have known in my life. They had 4 children, the youngest of whom, Sylvie, was 2 years younger than me and my particular companion in those years. Sylvie was the one who told me, in the winter of 1963, that there was something in their woodlot. She told me on the school bus on a Tuesday in December, in a voice that did not carry, because Sylvie had her mother's accuracy and knew the difference between things that need telling and things that needed containing. She said she had been going to the woodlot to help her father with the firewood cutting, and twice in the past month she had found the snow at the far edge of the lot, pressed down in an area larger than any animal she knew, and the bark of certain trees at a height above her head, worn smooth in a way that suggested rubbing, and a smell she could not name. But that was not any animal smell she had catalogued in 12 years on that farm. I listened to her carefully, and I looked at my hands in my lap on the bus seat, and I thought about my mother. And then I told her. I told her about the fitted boards and the loft, and Legrand and Octave's morning in September. I told her about the cows, about how they had always been calm, about the years without incident or harm, or anything that had ever given us a reason to feel what was not the right word to feel. She listened in the same way I had told her, without interruption, with the flat, serious attention she had inherited it from her mother. And when I was done, she sat with it for a moment, and then she said that her father had seen it in June. She said he had not told her mother, which surprised her, because Marcel Deschênes had never, to her knowledge, kept anything from Hortense, she said. She thought now he was working out what to say, I said. My mother had taken 2 years to tell me. Sylvie said that seemed about right for something of this size. Hortense Deschênes came to our farm the following Saturday afternoon, which was the 21st of December, 1963. She came alone, without Marcel, on the pretext of returning a pan she had borrowed in October. She stood in the yard with the pan, and she and my mother looked at each other. And my mother said, "Come in for coffee." And they went into the kitchen, and I was sent to do a task in another part of the house, which is to say I stayed on the stairs, where I could hear clearly. What passed between them in the kitchen that afternoon I can only partially report, because the voices were low, and I missed some of it, and understood less than I thought at the time. But I heard my mother say, at one point, that she had decided there was nothing to be done about it. And I heard Hortense say, in her small, precise voice, that she had come to the same conclusion, though she had taken 3 months about it. And I heard my mother laugh. Once, the short, dry laugh she reserved for things she found both absurd and correct. And I heard Hortense say, very quietly, that Marcel had seen it face to face in June in the woodlot, and had come back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table and had not spoken for the better part of an hour, and that she had not asked him what had happened, because she could see on his face that he was not frightened, only recalibrating, and she had given him the hour. She said that when he spoke, he had said only that the world was more full than they knew. She said she had told him she suspected that had always been true. After that afternoon, the two families managed the matter together, which is to say that when there was something to notice or to consider, there was now more than one household noticing and considering it. Marcel Deschênes was a practical man, and his practicality extended here the same as anywhere. He noted that Le Grand, which was the name the Deschênes adopted from us, without comment, seemed to use the woodlot as a transit route rather than a resting place, passing through in a general direction that, if you tracked it across the landscape, suggested movement between the large bush north of the 7th concession and our barn, which was the southernmost point it seemed to come. Marcel said he thought our barn was the only place it consistently stayed. My mother said she had believed that for some time. Marcel said he did not know why it would choose one barn over another, and my mother said she did not know either, but she had long since stopped requiring an explanation for every fact. I was 17 years old in the winter of 1964, and it was on a February evening of that year that my mother sat me down at this table and asked me to give my word. She had been thinking about it since the previous summer, she told me. She had watched me, watch Legrand for 4 years by then, and she had watched the way I moved in the barn, which was with the particular attentiveness of someone who is always partly listening for something. And she had decided that the question of what happened to this knowledge when she was gone was something she needed to settle before it settled itself without her input. Fernand, she said, would not be a problem. Fernand had already absorbed the whole thing into the fabric of his practical understanding of the farm and would neither broadcast nor investigate. He would simply know and keep knowing. But I was different, she said, and she said this without judgment, only with the accuracy that was her defining quality. She said I was the kind of person who would, eventually, feel the pull to tell someone, and she needed me to understand why that would be a harm. She did not speak about official bodies or government or any of that. She was not that kind of thinker. She said only this, that Legrand had come to our barn because it was safe there, and that the safety was a condition that existed because the barn was not spoken about, and that the moment the barn was spoken about to the wrong person, the safety would end, and she would not be the cause of that ending, and she would not allow me to be either. She said it had trusted us, as much as a thing that does not speak can trust, and that trust was not to be answered with exposure. She said the world did not need to know. She said the world, by which she meant the official world of records and authorities and newspapers, would only destroy what it could not explain, and she had seen enough of what that world did to things it did not understand to know she wanted no part of offering it another. I gave my word. I gave it at this table, looking at her face, which was still the pale cream of the kitchen wall, and I said I would not speak of it while she was alive, or while there was anyone who might be harmed by the speaking. I believe I have kept that. I am telling you now because every person who was present is gone, and because Legrand has not been in our barn in 22 years, and because Thérèse left me this machine and asked me to tell the old stories, and because I am 79 years old, and my heart is doing what hearts do, and because I have decided that a promise made to protect the living does not bind the dead, and Legrand is not here to be harmed by words. I will tell you what I remember of the years between 1964 and the last time I saw it. It came every winter without exception from 1959 through the winter of 1998. 39 winters. In some years it came earlier, in November, and stayed through March. In others it came after Christmas and left before February was done. The pattern in any given year was determined by conditions I could not read and did not try to. I only marked the first morning the straw was arranged, and the last morning it was flat, and thought about the number of nights in between. The most was 111 nights, in the winter of 1974. The least was 23 nights, in 1987, which was a mild winter. And I have wondered since whether the warmth of it meant the forest could sustain it longer without requiring the barn's shelter. But this is speculation, and I have learned to mark speculation plainly. I saw it directly, meaning face to face, with full light between us, 3 times in 39 winters. I want to be precise about this, because it matters to the shape of the thing I am trying to tell you. There were many other occasions on which I saw it in partial light, from a distance, going into or coming from the loft, or moving through the yard in a way that, as the years went on, no longer alarmed me at all, the way the movement of any known presence ceases to alarm after long acquaintance. But 3 times I saw it in the particular way I mean, which is face to face, with enough light to see clearly. The first was the winter of 1969. I was 22 years old, and I had come home from a year of nursing training in North Bay because my mother's health was going through a difficult period. Nothing that would kill her yet, but enough that she needed another pair of hands through the cold months. I had not seen Legrand in full light before that winter. My earlier observations had all been from a distance, or in the half-dark of the turned-down lantern. But on the 7th of January, 1969, I went to the barn in the early morning, before full light, to do the feeding, and I went through the side door, and it was at the end of the barn floor, not in the loft, standing between the last cow, stanchion, and the wall, in a way that meant I had walked toward it before I fully registered it was there. It turned. I have spent 56 years trying to find the right word for what I saw on its face when it turned and saw me, and the word I keep returning to is attention. It looked at me with its full attention, the way a person looks at another person when they have decided to actually see them, and its eyes were very dark and set deep in a broad face, with a brow that came forward in a way that would have looked severe on a human face, but did not look severe on this one. It did not bare teeth. It did not make any sound. It did not step back or step forward. It simply turned and looked at me and gave me its full attention for a long moment. And then it made a sound, a single low note from somewhere in its chest that seemed to me, though I could not have said why, to be addressed specifically to me and not to the space in general. Then it turned back to what it had been doing, which was examining the latch of the far door, the one that had broken in the November freeze, with an interest that seemed technical. I stood and watched it for another several minutes, and then I went about the feeding, and we were in the barn together for the better part of an hour, me at one end and it at the other, and the cows indifferent to us both. And when I left, it was still there. I did not cry until I got back to the house, not from fear and not from sorrow. I cried from a feeling I have never been able to name completely, something to do with the size of the world and the smallness of everything I had known about it, and the way a person feels when they realize they have been living inside a much larger story than the one they thought they were in. My mother asked me at breakfast what was wrong. I said nothing was wrong. She looked at my eyes, which were still red, and she did not push, which was the form her trust took. The second time was 1976, a Sunday afternoon in mid-January, when I had come back to the farm for the weekend from my nursing position in Sturgeon Falls, and I had gone to the bar for no particular reason except that. In those years, returning to the farm always meant returning to the barn, and it was in the loft when I came up, and it was awake. This time there was light. I had brought the good electric lantern my mother had finally allowed onto the farm in 1972, and when I came over the top of the ladder with the lantern raised, it was sitting upright in the corner, which I had not seen before, and it looked at me from its seated height, which was still well above my own standing height, and I looked at it, and neither of us moved for what I estimate was 2 minutes, which is a very long time to hold still. I saw its hands in that light for the first time with any clarity. They were proportioned in the way of hands, which is to say, I could see the structure of fingers and palm and wrist, but the scale was entirely other. The fingers as long as my forearm, and the knuckles dark and weathered in the way of hands that have worked rough surfaces for a very long time. One hand was resting in its lap, and one was on the straw beside it, palm down, and the one on the straw was resting with the specific flatness of a thing that does not need to grip because it is not nervous. And that quality, the absence of nervousness in those enormous hands, was the thing I studied most carefully in those 2 minutes. I said nothing. It made no sound. After 2 minutes, it settled back down into the sleeping position, folding itself into the corner with a deliberateness that reminded me of the way my mother used to settle herself into her chair when she had decided. A thing was decided, and I turned the lantern down and went back to the house and stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the snow. The third time was the winter of 1984. My mother was 74 years old that winter and was not well, and I had moved back to the farm permanently the previous spring to help with the last years of the herd, which we had reduced by then to 4 Holsteins and a single horse, because neither of us was young and the work had found its level. Fernand came on weekends and was practical and did the heavy things. But during the weeks, it was my mother and I, and the days had the specific quality of Daisy in which the future is present, but not yet arrived, when the life of a place is winding down, and both of you know it and neither of you says so. Legrand came that winter in November, earlier than usual. I knew from the loft on the morning of the 17th of November that it had arrived, and there was something in the timing, the earliness, the way the year had gone with my mother's health declining through the fall, that made me feel the two things were related, which is a feeling I can report but cannot explain. On the 22nd of November, I went to the barn in the last light of the afternoon, not to do any particular task, and I found it already on the barn floor, not in the loft, on the floor, and not moving. It was standing at the window on the south wall, the small 4-pane window through which the light of the house was visible in the evenings, and it was looking through that window in the direction of the house. And the house lights were on, because my mother was in the kitchen, beginning supper. I stood in the side doorway and watched it look at the house for a long time. I have thought about that image for more than 40 years. The size of it in the last November light, standing at the small window that was meant for the passage of light, and nothing more, looking at the kitchen window where my mother moved in her pale cream way. I do not know what it saw or what the looking meant to it. I know that it stayed at that window for the better part of an hour, until the kitchen light went out, and my mother must have moved to the other room, and then it turned from the window, and it saw me in the doorway. It was the longest I had ever been looked at by it, that third time, perhaps 3 minutes, perhaps 4. The light was going, and I could not see its eyes clearly, but I could see the shape of its face and the angle of its attention, which was entirely on me, and it made the chest note sound twice, the same sound it had made 15 years earlier, and the second time it made it, the pitch was lower, and I understood this the way you understand a thing that is spoken in a language you do not know, but have heard spoken long enough to catch the weather of it. Then it went up to the loft, and I went in for supper, and I did not tell my mother I had seen it looking at the house, because there was nothing to be done with that information, and some information belongs to the person who witnessed it alone. My mother died in April of 1988. Fernand sold the herd that summer, all 4 Holsteins and the horse, because neither of us had the heart or the back for it any longer, and the barn went empty. I kept the farm, and I have been here in this house since, in the way of people who belong to a place and cannot imagine belonging elsewhere, which has its own kind of peace to it, if you do not argue with it. Legrand came back in November of 1988, the first winter after my mother was gone, and I went to the barn on that first morning and found the straw, and I sat on the old stool for a long while, without the lantern, listening to the empty stanchions and the wind, and I thought about my mother standing at the base of the loft ladder in the fall of 1958, looking at something she had no name for, and deciding the way she decided things, from the inside out, from the evidence of the animals, and the quality of the stillness, and the precision of the fitted boards, that this was not a thing to fear. She was right. She was right, the way she was right about most things, which is to say, she had looked directly at what was in front of her and refused to add to it or take from it anything that wasn't there. Legrand came every winter after she died, until the winter of 2002, and then it did not come again. The winter of 2002 was its 39th winter, and on the last morning of it, the straw was still arranged in the corner, and by the following morning it was not, spread again in the random way of straw left to its own dispersal, and by the morning after that there was a new snow on the north yard, and no mark in it of any kind as there had never been. And that was the end. I have thought about what happened to it, and about whether the end of its coming here was a choice or a necessity, or simply the passing of a season that had run its natural course. I do not know. I have not known many things in this story, and I have tried to mark each one plainly, and this is another of them. I do not know where it went, or why it stopped coming, or what the 39 winters meant to it, if they meant anything at all in the way that things mean things to us, which they may not have. I know what they meant to me. I know that the winter mornings I spent checking the north corner of the loft were the mornings I felt most certainly that the world was a larger and more serious and more patient place than the one I could see from the road, and that feeling has not left me in the 22 years since it stopped coming, and I do not expect it to leave me before I am gone. Sylvie Deschênes moved to Vancouver in 1971 to work in a hospital there and married a man named Holloway and had 2 daughters, and she sent me a letter every Christmas until the year before last, when her health became what health becomes. Marcel Deschênes died in 1993 and Hortense in 2008, both on their own farm, both in the manner of people who have made their peace with the place they are in. Octave Pelletier retired to Verna in 1967 and died there in 1981 at the age of 71, and I drove to Verna for the funeral and stood at the grave in the cold November cemetery and thought about him coming down that loft ladder one, rung at a time with his hat in his hands, and I was grateful for him, for the quality of a man who could meet something he had no name for and put his hat back on his head and go back to work. Fernand died in 2011 at 86, at his own house in Mattawa, with his wife Celeste beside him and his 2 sons in the room. I was there. He did not speak of Legrand in his final days. He had never spoken of it very much. It had simply been a fact of the farm he grew up on, incorporated into his understanding of the world the way children incorporate the large and inexplicable when they are given room to do so without drama. He carried it quietly for 60 years, and he left the world with it still in him. And I think that was the right thing for him. And I think there is more than one right way to carry what you have been given to carry. I am the last one who was there. Therese's machine has been running this whole time on the table. I am looking at it now, at the small red light that means it is still listening. I do not know what she will do with what is on it when I give it back to her. She is 26 years old, and she is a practical and intelligent young woman, and she loved her grandfather Fernand. And she came and helped me put up preserves, and she left me the machine and asked for the old stories. And she did not know what she was asking, but she is the person I would choose, if I were choosing, to carry this particular piece of the world forward into whatever the world is becoming. The barn is still standing. I have kept it. My neighbors have asked me more than once why I keep a barn with no animals in it, why I pay to have the roof inspected and the boards treated and the foundation checked. And I tell them it is a good barn, and my grandfather built it, and I have not yet decided to let it go. This is true. It is also not the whole of why. There is a corner in the north end of the loft, 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, where the straw, when I put loose straw up there for the warmth it provides in deep winter, settles into a shape that is not quite random, not arranged the way it used to be, but not entirely as the wind and gravity alone would have it either. I have not decided what to make of this. I have not decided whether I am seeing what I want to see or seeing what is there to be seen. I have tried, in the manner of my mother, to look directly at what is in front of me and add nothing to it that isn't there. I turned the lantern down, and I watched, and I waited. That is what she taught me to do. The world is more full than we knew, and the knowing of it does not require anything from us except the willingness to be present and the discipline not to be afraid. I was not afraid. I have not been afraid in a very long time. The red light on the machine is still on. The snow outside the kitchen window is very deep, the same depth it was 61 years ago when my mother asked me to give my word. And the barn is 80 yards from this window, and the February light is going, and I have said what I came here to say. That is all I know. That is everything I am certain of. What it was, where it came from, what it made of us, what 39 winters in the corner of our loft meant to it, or whether it meant anything at all. I do not know. No one knows. I know only that it was careful with us and patient, and that it chose us, and that we were, in the way available to us, worthy of being chosen, and that my mother stood at the base of that ladder in the fall of 1958, and looked at what was in front of her, and decided the right thing, and kept deciding it for 30 years, and that I have tried, in the 61 years since she first asked me to decide the same way. The light is going now. I am going to turn this machine off and put it back in the drawer beside the sink, and I am going to put on my coat and my boots, and I am going to walk out to the barn in the last of the February light, because that is what I do in the evenings, and I am going to go up the ladder and stand at the top and look at the corner, and the straw will be the way it is, and I will note what I see without adding to it or taking from it, and then I will come back to the house and make my supper. This is what I am leaving for Therese. This is what happened here.